Grace to you and peace in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, and welcome to our weekly devotion, where we find this one thing from our Revised Common Lectionary for Sunday, August the 1st. My name is Pam Maston. I'm one of the associate pastors here at First Presbyterian Church of Fort Lauderdale, and thank you so much for joining me today. After graduating from seminary, I signed up for more training. Not my idea. As I got closer to graduation, it became clear that God was calling me into chaplaincy, and that required more training in the clinical setting, which is called Clinical Pastoral Education, also known as CPE. CPE brings theological students and ministers of all faiths into supervised encounters with persons in crisis. Out of an intense involvement with persons in need and the feedback from peers and teachers, students develop greater awareness of themselves and of the needs of those to whom they minister. Through theological reflection on specific human situations, they gain a new understanding of ministry. As a CPE student, one of our exercises each week was to write a verbatim about an interaction between a patient and me. And personal and theological reflection was also included on what happened in the room. After presenting the verbatim, then my supervisor and my peers would discuss the verbatim and ask me about my actions and my words. For example, were you sitting down? If the patient was in bed, were you towering over the patient or were you at eye level with the patient? It matters. Another question might be, did you introduce yourself? Turns out that also matters. Well, after a couple of years of CPE, all of us in the class ended up with greater self-awareness. We learned more about each other, our patients, and ourselves. We learned who we are and why. In other words, why do we do what we do? Think about it this week. It's an interesting question. Why do we do what we do? Well, in our passage from our Revised Common Lectionary for Sunday, August the 1st, we find that David went through some CPE training at the beginning of chapter 12 in a brief encounter with the prophet Nathan. We heard last week that in 2 Samuel chapter 11, we heard that David committed adultery with Bathsheba and arranged to have her husband Uriah killed. Here, at the beginning of chapter 12, David clearly does not start out with self-awareness. And Nathan confronts David, which leads to David condemning himself. With Nathan as his CPE supervisor, David learned more about himself. At first, he was unaware of his sin. But after his encounter with Nathan, David became remorsefully aware of what he had done. David did not make excuses. He did not blame others. He actually saw his sin. Friends, when we realize our sin, no matter how big or small it is, we are changed. Something changes within us. We start to think differently, asking questions such as this. What did I do to contribute to this conflict? David's CPE experience with Nathan helped him to realize his own sin. And more importantly, what David discovered is that as horrific as his sin was, God's grace is greater. The psalm for today, Psalm 51, is a wonderful example of confession and the amazing grace of God. This psalm is attributed to David after the events with Bathsheba and Uriah, though nowhere in the psalm does David mention it. We find that after his encounter with Nathan, David did become spiritually and emotionally conscious of his sin, and he wrote this beautiful psalm of God's grace. In verse 12, David says, "Restore to me the joy of your salvation and grant me a willing spirit to sustain me." Friends, while it is true that we have sinned, it is a greater truth that we are forgiven through God's love in Jesus Christ. This one thing for today is that God's amazing grace is always greater than our sin. And that, my friends, is good news. Friends, thank you so much for joining me today. Stay healthy, and we'll see you on Sunday.